I think, what's happening out there is that there's this fait accompli that executives are being paid excessively. And it's almost like it's been certified, it's been agreed, there is no debate. Executives are being paid excessively. Now, what are we going to do about it? Well, I think we've got to take a step back, okay, and say, what do we mean by excessive and who is being paid excessively? And then look at how we deal with those, rather than using this common brush to paint every executive without even challenging the debate to begin with.
So if you take South Africa, for example, on the lowest paid to the highest paid, the pay gap ratio might be 1 in 100 on average. In the UK, it's about 1 in 150. In the USA, it's about 1 in 345. In the Scandinavian countries, it's a bit less. It's about 1 in 80. And in New Zealand and Japan, maybe 1 in 50. So in terms of the pay gap ratio, we bang in the middle somewhere. So what's putting pressure on the system, I think, is pressure at the bottom needing to come up. Now, we've done some analyses, and if you halved CEO pay, it wouldn't put enough money in every worker's pocket. It would put something like 29 Rand a month in every worker's pocket. So that's not the solution. Halving CEO pay is not the solution. What the solution is that we need to move pay up, and to move pay up from the bottom, one needs a few criteria in place, antecedents, things like education and productivity and all of those things that go with it.
And that is the massive issue. And, the gap between the highest paid CEO and the lowest paid worker is infinitely better than the CEO and the unemployed. And that's where we keep missing the point. We keep looking at these, well, not we, many critics of executive pay keep looking at, the worker and the executive, but they forget about the unemployed. And to me, South Africa, it should really be about looking at the unemployed and what do we do there? Because that's the social unrest. That is the problem that we're facing. The thing, though, that one has to consider is that as companies grow and become bigger and bigger, and the world gets more complex when you're operating across a whole number of jurisdictions, and you've got all kinds of new rules and regulations that are being promulgated in South Africa, so the challenge to executives becomes more and more difficult. And as such, the biggest factor that drives executive pay is the size of the organization and the complexity of the organization. And as organizations start to grow and expand beyond the border of South Africa, and as the South African legislation becomes more complex, so the CEO's pay and the executive's pay tends to go up. Whereas a worker, unfortunately, if they are cleaning or doing reception work or whatever it is, that doesn't necessarily get more complex. It doesn't change because of the size of the company. So one has to, one can't naively just compare a ratio and say if that ratio gets bigger, we're going in the wrong direction. It's a very, very complex issue, this. And my concern is that the public and politicians, once again, are being driven by a different agenda, and an agenda that doesn't fully grasp and understand the situation.
It's not just a South African phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon that the pay gap's growing. So I don't think anybody has a quibble with paying fairly. If I said to a worker, do you think that we should pay the executive fairly? The worker will say yes. And if you ask a government official or a trade unionist or CEO, no one has a quibble with fair pay. The issue is the definition of fair pay. How do you define fair pay? We've come up with our best attempt at defining fair pay, and it is free of bias. It is using systems and processes that are internationally acceptable. And I think that South Africa does a pretty good job at determining fair pay. The complexity here that we have is mass unemployment, and mass unemployment means that our Gini coefficient is the highest in the world. If we had to halve our unemployment from 30% down to 15%, our Gini coefficient would go from 0.65 to 0.4, which is almost bang in the middle of the rest of the world. So it's numbers like that that get thrown around loosely. Of course, the elephant in the room is that you are working against global economic forces and trade forces where organizations are definitely getting more complex, and pay around the world is getting more complex, and that gap is increasing around the world. So it'll be quite an interesting debate to see how one reverses that trend in one country that plays on the global stage of an increasing wage gap.
The best way of sort of determining executive pay is to link it to performance in the organization. Your guaranteed pay for a CEO is meant to be somewhere around, let's call it roughly a third of the total package, okay? And it varies, but let's just take it as a third. The other 2/3 should be from variable pay if the executive is achieving the targeted levels of performance. So the real value add should be measured in the performance pay, and that's the combination of the short-term, the annual incentive, and the long-term incentive. And the short-term incentives are not that difficult because setting goals for 1 year in most years is reasonable. One can reasonably set goals and measure at the end of the year. The problem comes in the long-term incentives, where you're trying to set goals for 3 years' time. And to the extent that you can get that right, there's no doubt that the value that an executive brings to the organization will then determine their pay. And that's the way that it should be done. Where we get problems is when the link to performance is not set properly.
One of the hats I wear is supervising MBA students, and every year we take CEO pay on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, we take company performance, and we do correlations and say, are they correlated? And there is a correlation. So sometimes there's a lag factor, but broadly speaking, if you take over 300 CEOs on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and you look at several metrics of company performance, for example, EBITDA, earnings per share, headlines earnings per share, return on capital employed, and EVA, economic value added, there are very strong correlations between that and CEO pay. So that they are paid according to performance actually exists. But in the court of public opinion, it's the optics that gets judged, and these MBA theses don't find their way into the court of public opinion. I think we're into an era of more transparency, and the era says, don't just put the number in the annual financial statement or the remuneration report. You need to explain what the person did to earn it. Once I know that 10,000 jobs were created and the shareholder return exceeded the peers, and there were 3 or 4 other metrics that were very, very important to the company and the shareholder, then I'm more inclined to accept the 15 or 16 million bonus.